Hi, I'm Norman Lebrecht, and I'm making my long-delayed Wigmore Hall debut, which is a thrilling occasion. I had hoped that it would be a packed hall with people queuing for returns around the corner, but this is COVID, so we make do with what we have. But fortunately, I have with me Daniel Lebrecht, who has given several recitals here before, and he is here essentially to steady my nerves. Normally, the people in this packed hall would know me as somebody who writes mostly about music, but I'm also a novelist and a historian, and I'm here today to talk about my latest book, Genius and Anxiety, which looks at a question that has preoccupied me for most of my adult life. And it's a very simple question. It's between the middle of the 19th and the 20th centuries, there are about 36 individuals who changed the way that we perceive the universe, whether scientifically or physically, intellectually, spiritually. There are 36 people who changed how we come to grasp with reality, how we come to grips with reality. Of these 36 people, half were Jews. Wait a minute, how's that possible? Jews in this period, between 1847 and 1947, constitute about 0.02% of world population. How is it possible that they should be taking such a commanding role in our reconception of the universe? And all of the answers that have been given in the past were, to me, unsatisfying. Some said, well, it's because the Jews came out of the ghetto and they had it was the force of a cork exploding from a champagne bottle. They had been cooped up for 1,500 years and suddenly they were free to mingle with society. Well, I'm afraid that's historically untrue. They came out of the ghetto in the late 18th century. They'd had 2 generations before this impact made itself felt in the middle of the 19th century. Others give a genetic argument that Jews were genetically predisposed to be intellectual, which we can dismiss as nonsense. And I can disprove it easily because the individuals that I'm writing about within this period are mostly confined to the center of Europe. Very few of them in Russia, hardly any of them are in the great Jewish settlement around North Africa, the Maghreb, and the Arab countries. So why is it that only a certain part of the Jewish world was producing genius after genius after genius after genius? And some of these names are, of course, household names to this day. There's Marx, there's Freud, there's Proust, there's Einstein, there's Kafka. I mean, there are people that we drop into our conversations practically every dinner time. How is it that they were all Jews and they were all functioning in this time? And in order to come towards a somewhat connective element that, say, conjoins Benjamin Disraeli to Arnold Schoenberg, I went down a Freudian line of inquiry. Sigmund Freud, among the many inventions that he threw out in his writings and in his practice, came up with the idea of the unconscious. It's not a completely original idea because you can find it in quite early Jewish sources, but the unconscious, as Freud defines it, is a parallel way of being in addition to the physical being that we think we are. I am standing here and thinking that this is who I am on the Wigmore Hall stage. At the same time, there is an unconscious that is running underneath me, perhaps subversively, and doing other things and suggesting other things. And what I'm finding in this history of genius and anxiety is a collective unconscious among the Jewish people. I could give you many examples, but let's just start with some music, and then we can see how it's going to work. I'm going to look in this talk at the way that 5 or 6 individuals changed the Western idea of music, what music is, how it functions, and what role it plays in our lives. And we're going to start with the first Jew who made an impact on Western music, Felix Mendelssohn, acclaimed in his teens as the biggest talent since Mozart, dead at practically the same age as Mozart, a really very short, very compact, very concentrated life. And we're going to start with one of his songs without words. Daniel. Fabulous. Now, you're a Wigmore Hall audience. You recognize the opening of that, don't you? It's the opening of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. 70 years later, ba-ba-bum, 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 ba-ba-bum. It's the same phrase. What is Mahler doing, taking a fairly obscure song without words of Mendelssohn and turning it into the opening of his Fifth Symphony, a central major work? What's the connection between Mahler and Mendelssohn? Actually, none whatsoever. Mahler didn't think very highly of Mendelssohn. He didn't like him very much. He performed the Italian Symphony from time to time, but he was not an admirer of Mendelssohn's, and he particularly didn't like anyone to suggest that there might be an affinity between them because both were of Jewish origin. What I'm suggesting is that there is an unconscious transmission here between the phrasing that Mendelssohn uses at the opening of this piece and the phrase that Mahler uses at the opening of his Fifth Symphony. If you go on to the second phrase within this piece, it sounds suspiciously like the Israeli national anthem Hatikva. Listen to it again at home. There is a a cultural unconscious that functions between these two. And if we're going to understand it, we need to take a look at the extent to which Mendelssohn is Jewish. From one angle, he couldn't be more Jewish. He is the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn, who was the greatest Jewish philosopher of the 18th century. Jewish religious philosopher of the 18th century, man who translated the Hebrew Bible into a German that was far more fluent and colloquial than Luther's German, which had been used until then, and a very central figure, the first Jew really to engage intellectually with German society. That was Mendelssohn's grandfather. Mendelssohn was baptized in a Lutheran as a child and never referred to himself as being Jewish. It was something that was in the past, something that he didn't discuss at all. And to all intents and purposes, he was the first musician of Europe. He was the music director in Leipzig. He was the friend of kings and emperors and Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And he entertained them, and he was regarded as their equal. And there is nothing possibly Jewish about Mendelssohn until you look at his letters. Not the published ones, the unpublished ones, the ones that the family kept and they're starting to come to light. And one of those which I bring to light in Genius and Anxiety is a letter he wrote home after an early visit to London. He'd arrived here and they said, where would we like, which of the sites would you like to see? And he said, I'd like to go to the Houses of Parliament. And he had a particular reason for doing so, because the House of Commons that day in 1831 was discussing Jewish emancipation. It was called the Jew Bill. And Mendelssohn was there basically to lend support, moral, spiritual, cultural, intellectual, whatever, to lend support to those who were about to grant or were debating whether to grant rights to Jews that they didn't enjoy in any other European country apart from France. And he wrote home to his mother and to his family about this debate. And in this letter, he uses several phrases that are in Yiddish or in Hebrew, phrases that are designed to bypass the censor. The internal language of the Mendelssohns is a Jewish language. The unconscious of the Mendelssohns remains Jewish. And Felix Mendelssohn, I could give many other examples. You'll have to have me back here in the Wigmore Hall to do it. I know Daniel's willing. Felix Mendelssohn is profoundly Jewish in his music, as he is in his thinking, as he is in his secret language. And somehow this language seeps through and is picked up by later Jewish musicians as part of their common heritage. And that intellectual heritage is something that goes back to the dawn of civilization. It goes back to the Mishnah, the code of Jewish law from the 2nd century, and to the Talmud, which is dated in its final edition in the 8th century. So there is a great body of thinking to which even those who are not familiar with it are very deeply immersed. But let's put Mendelssohn to one side. We'll come back to Mahler in a minute. I am dying to talk to you about Alkan, because Alkan in certain ways is regarded by the French as the acme of Jewishness. Charles-Henri Valentin Alkan, his name was. And he was the most powerful pianist of his time. Liszt said he was the only pianist that he, Liszt, feared. Chopin, in his will, left an instruction that the only person who was to finish his unfinished works was Alkan, the only one he trusted, the only one who had the virtuosity and the understanding of virtuosic thinking. Remember that both Liszt and Chopin are profoundly anti-Semitic, and both of them recognized Alkan as the master of their trade. Now, the one thing that anybody who has heard of Alkan knows about him is the manner of his death. This is the signal fact about Alkan, and that is that he was found dead in his apartment, crushed by a bookcase from which he had been taking down a volume of the Talmud from the top shelf. It's there in all the musical dictionaries. Everybody knows this is how Alkan died. It's a myth, of course. When you come to check the facts, which are there, obviously the police were called and they made a report, and that report still exists in the police archives in Paris, where I've consulted it. He was found dead actually in the kitchen where he'd been preparing his evening meal. He was a recluse, and of course nobody keeps a bookcase in the kitchen, let alone a bookcase from which you're going to take down a Talmud from the top floor. But the myth exists and was circulated because it signified Alkan as somebody who was so Jewish that he could not be absorbed in cultured French society. Alkan goes into posterity marked by the Talmud that supposedly killed him. The music that he wrote is so far ahead of its time. It's so futuristic, one almost thinks it belongs to tomorrow rather than today. Oh, Daniel, play us something. Oh, that's wonderful. I want to hear it again. Thank you, Daniel. Any idea what this piece is about? It's about a day at the seaside. It's perhaps a little ironic. It's intended to be impressionistic, but it's not like any seaside that I've been to. It doesn't represent somebody walking up and down, licking an ice cream or getting into their swimming things and jumping into the sea. It's profoundly ominous. It is self-contradictory all the way through. And the tension rises as it continues. You sort of feel the world is fragmenting around you. Something is going to happen. This is going to be some horror film scenario, a horror film that hasn't yet been written. A tsunami is coming. Alkan is warning us about terrible things. He is terrified, and he's making us terrified. And he's putting this into a piano piece that is supposed to be played in your living room. Every piece of Alkan's that I hear fills me with confusion and terror and anxiety. And in order to see how he's writing this way and why he's writing this way, we need to look a little bit at the circumstances of his life. He was, at a certain point, so prolific that he had 3 Paris publishers, and when they told him they couldn't take any more work from him, he got a boat and went to London and got himself a couple of London publishers so that he could continue this voluminous output. He was as creative, as inventive, as full of music in his way as Mendelssohn had been before him, but the music was unlike anything else that anyone was playing. The opening of this piece, there are hints of Schoenberg in it. He's looking forward. There are loose notes, there are stray notes that are floating around. They could be Kurtag, they could be today. So Alkan is completely himself. In the middle of his life, in the middle of his 30s, he is recognized as the greatest pianist alive, and a vacancy arises as head of piano at the Paris Conservatoire. Then, as now, these things are politically contested and there are parties that form behind individuals, but it seemed to be a shoo-in. Alkan was the greatest pianist alive. Surely they should make him head of the piano department at the Conservatoire. They didn't. They chose some other mediocrity. And Alkan's response was incredibly Jewish. He went home to his flat and he locked the door and he didn't come out for 25 years. I mean, yes, he went out, he did his shopping, he had people visit him and so forth. But for the most part, he adopted the life of a recluse with his Talmud for 25 years. This was 1849 to 1872 or 3. Finally, after the Franco-Prussian War, after the siege of Paris, after all the devastation, as a fairly old man, he came out of his house and booked the Salle Erard, the equivalent of the Wigmore Hall, to give what was essentially a private recital. There were a couple of placards that went up on the walls of Paris, but there was no ticket selling, there was no hype, there was no media. It just said, Monsieur Alkan will play at the Salle Erard at 9 o'clock. And all the cognoscenti, all the great pianists, all the cognoscenti came to hear Alkan, to hear this quite extraordinary pianist in the last years of his life. What was it that had provoked such extreme behavior? And the legend of Alkan, the pianist, in his later years, still rolls through our times. Ferruccio Busoni was his great admirer. In the next generation, it was Edwin Fischer. There was an English pianist called Ronald Smith, who I'm sure played here at the Wigmore Hall, who used to give lecture recitals of Alkan here, and I heard him at the Queen Elizabeth Hall. And Ronald would pick out in Alkan anticipations of, for instance, Mahler's Sixth Symphony, which he found in an Alkan piece. He found pieces of Zemlinsky. He found Alkan writing 100 years ahead of himself And very often, the music that he was anticipating was by composers who were Jewish like himself. The cultural unconscious was working overtime. When Alkan locked himself in his apartment, when he said, I don't want to have anything to do with the world, when he said, France has rejected me, music has rejected me, I'm going to be here alone with my Talmud, what was he actually doing? He was performing an act. Freud describes similar things. An act that is described in Yiddish as Bräuges. He says to society, you have offended me, you have injured me. I am therefore going to withdraw and injure myself more than you could possibly do to me. I am going to take an extreme action so that the worst that you could possibly do to me, I have already done to myself. I have become isolated from the world and locked myself to my apartment. Where does this idea of locking oneself away from the world come up again in music? Gustav Mahler, Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen. I'm lost to the world. The song that he wrote, the seminal moment of his life. He's about to get married to Alma. He's at last found a girl that he loves. He's going to get married to her. He's written her the Adagietto of the Fifth Symphony, which is supposed to be full of love. And at the same time, with the same phrases of the Adagietto of the Fifth Symphony, he writes, Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen. I am lost to the world. I may love you, you may love me, you will never reach me, because I am locked away in my Jewishness in a manner that Alkan locked himself away in a kind of protective isolation. I will lock myself away so that you can't get there first and do something worse to me. We find in Alkan other themes. What we find enormously is irony. He writes a requiem for a dead parrot. What is the first piece of music that we know that was written by the young Gustav Mahler, aged 6 years old? It is a waltz followed by a lament for a dead parrot. Mahler's never heard of Alkan. He's never heard of him. It's the unconscious again. It's working overtime. They are speaking somehow the same intellectual language without knowing it, because you don't know what your unconscious is doing. I don't know what my unconscious is doing. Freud doesn't know what your unconscious is doing, but he will charge you a lot of money in the process of finding out. But it is working here through the development of Western music, through Mendelssohn and Alkan and Mahler. What are Mahler's great innovations in music? There are two of them. The first you'll find at the opening of his First Symphony, where for 4.5 minutes nothing happens. A 27-year-old composer writing his First Symphony in Budapest, presenting his First Symphony in Budapest in 1889, and for 4 minutes his devoted audience are sitting there saying, what's going on? We don't have a theme. We're getting nothingness. We're getting an A in the strings. We're getting certain distant notes somewhere out there. What Mahler's doing is writing a kind of musical autobiography. He's remembering as a child. He saw terrible scenes. His parents had a stormy marriage, and Mahler, as a little boy, 6, 7 years old, would run away. And he would run and hide in the woods, and nobody would miss him. And he would sit there in the woods, and he would listen to the world going on around him, until finally, as it got dark, they said, where's Gustav? It's dinner time. And somebody would be sent out to find him in the thick of the woods. And in putting this as the opening of his First Symphony, he is presenting a completely different idea of music. Music is not something that takes place in the concert hall. Music is not something that we can lock beyond the doors of the concert hall and say, here is where we come to escape. Here is where we come to experience music. Oh no, music is everywhere. Because even as you're listening to music from this stage of the Wigmore Hall, you're listening to Daniel or you're listening to me talk. There are other things going on. You can hear somebody breathing a road behind you. You can hear perhaps a little bit of traffic at the back. That too is part of music. The ambiance is part of music. Music is greater than music itself, and Mahler expresses it much later in 1907. He goes for a walk in the woods. He's always in the woods. He's often in the woods. He goes for a walk in the woods near Helsinki with Jean Sibelius, a younger composer. Sibelius has just finished his third symphony, and he's very full of himself. And he says, Herr Mahler, he says, symphony is the most wonderful thing. It is the acme of musical logic. You can write a symphony without a single superfluous note. It's like a glass of iced water. And Mahler says to Sibelius, Quatsch, that's rubbish. He says, die Symphonie ist wie die Welt, es muss alles umfassen. Symphony is like the world. It must include everything. If you say that the symphony is a glass of iced water, that it's an object, that it's just there to be admired, you are distorting what I see as the function of music, which is to be part of life, to include life, and to reflect life back to itself. That is the first major revolution that Mahler makes in music. The second comes in the third music of the first symphony. Since we're not giving musical examples of Mahler, I won't dwell too much on it. But it is the introduction of irony to music. It is the ability to make a phrase sound both as what it is and what it isn't. Up to Mahler, music was really quite linear. Composers told a story in their symphonies. With Mahler, it can mean two things. He can take a phrase that seems to be a kindergarten song, a nursery song, Frère Jacques, Bruder Martin, bum 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 bum. He puts it in the minor, and by putting it in the minor, he turns it into something else altogether. It's the story of a child's funeral. So he is investing music with multiple meanings, often contradictory, and Mahler is thus the beginning of multilinearity in music, of music having the possibility to carry several meanings at the same time. But I want to move on to Mahler's principal protege, Arnold Schoenberg. And in fact, we'll start at the end of Mahler's life here. We'll start with a piece that Schoenberg wrote on a rainy afternoon in 1911 when he came home from the funeral of his mentor, his protector, his friend, Gustav Mahler. It's a lunar landscape. It's a world of its own. Schoenberg has rejected the totality of Western civilization and Western music and said, this tonal system that you've developed over the past 500 years, I don't need it. I belong to an older civilization. goes back a couple of thousand, maybe 3,000 years. I, as a Jew, have an awareness of a time before tonality, of a time when all notes were equal, when they didn't have to be arranged as do, re, mi, when I, as a composer, can arrange them in the order that I want to, or in no order at all. This is atonal. This is an absolute slap in the face of Western music. It is an assertion by Arnold Schoenberg, there is another way, there is another music. What you regard as supreme, the supremacy of German music, the supremacy of Europeanism, actually there are other cultures and civilizations. There is a diversity that you don't recognize. And I, Arnold Schoenberg, whom you don't like much anyway because I'm Jewish, I am going to take you down paths that you've never been before. The little phrases that you hear in this tiny piece, which is less than a minute long, can we hear that bell sound again? Those are the bells that are tolling for Mahler's funeral. Schoenberg knows that Mahler left instructions. He did not want a religious funeral. He did not want a funeral at all. He did not want a priest at his bedside. He did not want to be claimed by Christianity or indeed by any other religion. He had rejected Judaism as well. He wanted to disappear in his own way, not to be claimed by other civilizations such as Christianity. And they gave him a Christian burial. And within those phrases, there is the force of nuclear anger. As you play them, Daniel, I hear the rage. They sound distant. They sound removed. But they're angry that there is such a gulf of comprehension between a genius who happens to be Jewish and the society which rejects his Jewishness. There is also something else. There is also fear. Schoenberg is aware of that fear, and we'll see in a minute how that fear plays a role in the evolution of Western music. Schoenberg persists with atonality for about a dozen years. And then in 1921, on a walk with one of his disciples, Josef Rufer, he says, atonality doesn't work for me. I have discovered a method that is going to ensure the supremacy of German music for the next 100 years. Note those words, supremacy, German music. The last two, as far as Schoenberg were concerned, were a tautology. Music was German, German was music, and supremacy was an expression of an attitude that, an imperialist attitude, if you like, that European civilization held itself to be the highest that there had ever been in the whole of human history. Schoenberg is saying, I, Arnold Schoenberg, who happens to be Jewish, is going to give you a completely different agenda, and that is called music written on a row of 12 notes, where the composer arranges the notes in his own scale before he starts writing, and then creates something completely different. The supremacy of German music, remember that. He talks of the supremacy of German music, and a dozen years later he is expelled from Germany. The Nazis come to power. The first thing that Schoenberg does when he is forced out of Germany and the German music that he served, in Paris, he goes to a synagogue and asks to be readmitted to the Jewish people, to reconvert to Judaism. And they said, you can't do that. If you're born a Jew, you stay a Jew, and it doesn't matter what else you do in between, but we can't readmit you. He demands anyway that they have a ceremony, a service by which he can formally become Jewish again. He then goes on to America. He lives in considerable need and poverty in Hollywood. But he has a very nice neighbor, and they play tennis together on the neighbor's court. The neighbor's called George Gershwin. And George Gershwin, who was always very insecure about his musical ability, Gershwin asked everyone he met for lessons. He went to Ravel, he said, please teach me. He had Schoenberg living next to him and playing tennis with him. He said, Schoenberg, please, give me some lessons. I can pay you properly. You don't have to, count the number of biscuits you're putting on the table. And Schoenberg said, no. He said, I can't teach you. He said, I'd only make you a bad Schoenberg, and you're such a good Gershwin already, which was true. Gershwin was part of one of the greatest cultural phenomena of the 20th century, and indeed of the 21st, which is mass entertainment. He was part of a wave of Jews that came to America and perceived that America was different from Europe, different in many ways, different in its opportunities, different in the ability of a simple person to become suddenly very, very wealthy and to have a lot of time on their hands. And the musicians and the artists who came from Europe saw this spare time, this free time, and they said, we can make something. We have to fill this time. And so they filled it with what we now call mass entertainment, which is movies and which is music. The music that Gershwin and his friends wrote was derived from their contact on hot summer's day on the front stoops of apartment buildings in New York, with their contact with the children of slaves who'd come up from the South and who were now living also pretty impoverished in New York. And the guys started singing. Somebody maybe brought down a guitar or a banjo or something. And the Jews and the African Americans found that they had certain things in common, one of which was an affinity for minor keys, which the African Americans called blues, and the other was certain rhythms that seemed to work together, and out of that fusion came what we know as popular music. And of course records have been invented, and records were starting to be sold. The first million-selling record was Alexander's Ragtime Band, which was by Irving Berlin, one of the Jewish composers in New York. And there were various others, the most successful of whom was George Gershwin. But within the core of George Gershwin is something that's profoundly Jewish, and I want to look at that a little bit of detail in the time that remains to us. Daniel? This is Daniel's own arrangement. What's going on here? It ain't necessarily so. This is the ultimate act of iconoclasm. This is a Jewish boy saying the things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. He's turning everything on its head, but he's doing it in an extremely Jewish way, because he's doing it with a tune that is the mirror image of the tune that is used in rabbinical cemeteries for studying the Talmud. Da 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 da. No, da 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 da. No, I'm going to challenge you. Da 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 da. It is the, it's the sort of melody of challenging study. The Talmud is studied in pairs, usually, and in pairs, this is what's going on in It Ain't Necessarily So. Gershwin called the mode that he wrote in, it's a kind of Phrygian mode, that's the classical term for it. Gershwin called it Fragisch. Fragisch is a Yiddish word, it means questioning. Everything that Gershwin writes is a challenge to the existing order. He's pushing out the boundaries, he's being iconoclastic. And what we have to listen to, what we have to listen for in his music is something else, which is a certain agitation, that sub-theme that comes out, the way it suddenly goes into there's a rattle and a roll, or a rock and a roll and something, and everything is falling apart. What is that? That's anxiety. Can we just hear that bit again? Right, so we've been coasting along quietly on a little Talmudic study with me challenging you, you challenging me, and then suddenly there's a rattle down the road, and that could be the next pogrom. One of the things that fuels this tremendous wave of Jewish invention in this period between the middle of the 20th century is raw fear. And it catches people, it makes people do things they didn't want to do. Freud got many things wrong. One of the reasons that he got them so wrong was that he was under such time pressure to produce, because at the back of his mind, in his unconscious, is the idea that he might not be tolerated for very long, that there might be an attack on him, a physical attack, a professional attack, that he might be expelled, that he might be murdered, that there might be another genocide. And this lies underneath most of the individuals that I discuss in the book, Genius and Anxiety. It lies underneath all of the composers that I'm discussing here. It lies at the heart of Gershwin's work. There is the Fragisch element. There is the constant questioning of who am I? Where am I going in this piece of music? I'm insecure. I don't even know that I want to be a composer. I should go to Gershwin. I should go to Ravel. I should go to Schoenberg. I should go to anybody and get some extra lessons, because I'm not a real Western composer because I'm Jewish. And the next bit is, between you and me, I'm really worried of what's going to happen tomorrow. Let's have another piece. does that piece leave us? We come out of that saying, excuse me, who am I? It's one of the most unsettling pieces that he ever wrote. And it's called The Man I Love. It may be a hint of some bisexuality in Gershwin. It's quite possible. There are all sorts of indications. His private life was very private indeed. He never married. We don't actually know what went on. He was quite antisocial. If there was a party going on, George would be sitting in the corner tinkling at the piano. He didn't really engage with people. He stood apart from them. And in some way, he had this identity confusion, which is expressed in this song, which says, who am I and where do I belong? And in the early 1930s, when he's at the pinnacle of his success, he's writing for Broadway. His songs are selling in millions. He picks himself up from New York and goes to Hollywood where no one knows him. Start again. Just doesn't want to be part of that scene. Very unusual man, deeply unsettled, and at the same time preoccupied with that issue of identity. Who am I? If I'm Jewish, what does that make me? Do I need to be anxious? And all of those things are heard in The Man I Love. Often, his brother Ira wrote the words for him mostly. But if Ira was out getting a bagel or something and George had written a tune, George would write Yiddish words to it before Ira got back. His first language is the Jewish language, and it's only later that he presents it as the language of mass entertainment. But I'm going to give you one of the core elements of Gershwin's Jewish DNA in his music. And then let's see where we take it from there. Summertime. It's Gershwin's torch song. It's the most famous piece he ever wrote. It comes from Porgy and Bess, which is the first genuine American opera. We recognize it as such today, but it took 50 years from its first production in the 1930s to get to the Metropolitan Opera in the late 1980s. There was a lot of resistance to Porgy and Bess, let's not forget, because it was an expression of the existence of a deprived and alienated community, of the African Americans living in very, very poor circumstances and trying to make a living as best they can. And it was written by a Jewish composer who was expressing this affinity between Jewish music and black music, unconsciously, but as best he could, and with all the fear in the world, all the fear that has driven the oppressed and the depressed and the deprived in society. And in this signal moment in Porgy and Bess, he drops in summertime. And that opening phrase of summertime, you would be entitled to believe that it reflects some spiritual or some other song of the African American experience. But summertime, da-da-dum, reverse it, and you have Baruchu, which is the core motif of the Ashkenazi Jewish Sabbath morning service. Out of his unconscious, Gershwin has gone back to the synagogue, has gone back to his heritage, and has found a fusion in his Jewish existence of what it is to be shunned and despised and marginalized and pushed to the edges of society. As Handel wrote in Messiah, despised and rejected. He's creating in Porgy and Bess, and in Summertime in particular, a kind of anthem for all of those the world has rejected. He is drawing upon his Jewish humanitarian and universalist roots to bring this out in Summertime. And he's doing it at the same time with this anxiety that, famous as he is, wealthy as he is, important as he is, renowned as he is, the man who is astride the new revolution of American popular music, that someday they're going to turn against me. Someday they're going to come and get me. Someday the anxiety is going to overwhelm me. And when he started getting headaches, he thought maybe this was a neurosis, and he went to see a psychiatrist, as one would, for a while, not realizing that there was a tumor growing in his brain, and when they operated, he died on the surgeon's table, again at a similar age to Mozart. So what we see in this period, and I've just taken this cross-section of musicians within the whole spectrum of civilization that was changed by Jewish iconoclasm in this period, what we've seen is this fusion of enormous invention, of a willingness to challenge everything in society, to overturn everything, to break the idols, to start anew, to find a new science, to blow up the world if necessary with nuclear science, allied to this internal fear that as a minority you are never safe. And that is the tension that is engendered with genius and anxiety, and these are the seeds of the world we live in today. Thank you so much for listening, both to me and to Daniel.